Hello everyone, welcome to topic 5. So we're going to start off with homeostasis, which means maintaining a constant internal environment. Now in our body, there are a couple of things that we want to maintain. Those include glucose levels. So if glucose levels fall too low, you won't have enough energy, you'll feel lethargic and tired. But if glucose levels go too high, then you can end up getting diabetes. Ions, so this includes things like sodium, chloride, etc. And this is mainly really important for chemical reactions, but also maintaining the size of your cells. And we'll talk about that later. Water levels. Now, maintaining water is called osmoregulation. We know our body is made of 70% water, so it's really important for chemical reactions. However, if water levels go a bit too high, then our cells can actually expand and burst, and if water levels go too low, our cells can shrivel up. So we want to make sure that that's maintained. Temperature, again, really important for our enzymes. If temperature goes too high, our enzymes get denatured, which means really important chemical reactions can't take place anymore. And again, if it gets too low, it'll be too slow for the enzymes to work. Now, temperature maintaining is called thermal regulation. Okay, negative feedback. Now, if they ask you to define it, the definition is mechanism that counteracts a change to return levels back to normal. So, for example, on this graph, you can see on the left, you have blood thyroxine levels, but it could be any other condition. It could have glucose or temperature or water. And you can see the dotted line is the normal level. So, for example, let's say for some reason, the thyroxine level goes up above normal. Negative feedback will cause that to go back down to normal. And let's say it goes back down, again, negative feedback will cause it to go back up. So don't worry about memorizing this example. We're going to do that in a second. But the main thing is this. You have a receptor that detects a change. That then goes to the central nervous system, which coordinates a response. And then you have effectors, which carry out the action. And that is basically how your body works to maintain levels. Okay, our nervous system's main job is to allow us to respond to changes in the environment. Now, a stimulus is the definition of so a stimulus is a change in the environment. So for example, smelling a fragrance, or hearing something, or seeing, or like a light flashing in your eye. Those are all changes in the environment, and they are all picked up by receptors which are found on our sense organs. Now we have 5 different sense organs because we have 5 different senses. So those include our eyes, nose, tongue, ears, and skin. Those are the 5 sense organs. Now, on those sense organs, we have receptors. So, for example, in this particular example, on the skin, you have receptors. By the way, on the skin, there are 2 types of receptors. You have temperature receptors, so you can feel heat, but also pressure receptors, so that you can feel pain. Now, those receptors are then connected to the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord, via sensory neurons. Okay, so sensory neuron brings it into the spinal cord, and then your central nervous system coordinates a response, and then it sends it back out via motor neurons to an effector. So again, that same arc is written over here. You have stimulus, change in the environment, picked up by a receptor. You have sensory neuron, central nervous system, motor neuron, effector. Now, there are 2 types of effectors. You can have muscles, which will contract or relax, or glands, which will release hormones. And then finally, you have your response. Also, it doesn't mention over here, but there's another neuron between the sensory and the motor neuron called a relay neuron. Now, this neuron is only found in the central nervous system. Okay, so you have reflexes and voluntary responses. Now, the difference is that a reflex is automatic and it's usually for protection, whereas a voluntary response is something that requires thinking, so it involves the conscious part of the brain, whereas a reflex only goes to the spinal cord. Therefore, it's much faster. Okay, so we can see in this example, this bee has stung the person. So again, it's going to be picked up by the receptor, sensory neuron, spinal cord, out via the motor neuron to the effector. Okay, so that's a reflex. Now, a synapse is the connection between 2 neurons. So you can see how the impulse, electrical impulse, arrives, but there's a dead end. So how does it get from this neuron to the next one? Well, that's how a synapse works. So you say the following: impulse arrives to the end of neuron. Then neurotransmitters, which are these little chemicals over here. You can call them neurotransmitters, or you can just call them chemicals. They are released, they diffuse across the gap and bind. Make sure you say the word bind to receptors, because that's actually a really important point. And finally, a new impulse is then generated in the next neuron. Okay, so that's the synapse. Now, this is quite interesting. Some animals have poisons, and if they inject you with that poison, it can actually paralyze you. So it can make your muscles it can prevent your muscles from working. They might actually ask you to apply your knowledge and explain that using neurons. So let's have a look at this scenario. Let's say this person, so here's the brain, you can see there are some neurons going down all the way to the muscle. Okay, so if the frog, let's say, injects the person on his leg, okay, what that's going to do is those poisons are going to come and they're going to circulate in his blood. So how will that prevent his muscles from contracting and therefore paralyzing him? The way that works is the following. So if you look at this again, this is a synapse. You can see impulse will arrive, chemicals are getting ready to be released. So again, they get released and they're going to move towards the receptors. However, don't forget that now there's also the poison which is in the blood as well. Those poisons are actually going to bind to the receptors as well. Because they're going to bind to receptors, that means the normal neurotransmitters cannot bind. So these guys cannot bind anymore. Since they can't bind, that means another impulse will not be generated in the next neuron. So information will not be carried through to the muscle. And as a result, the person will not be able to contract his leg. So he will be paralyzed. Okay, investigating reaction time. So this is a very common example or experiment where you basically get someone to drop a ruler and then you have to catch it as quickly as you can. So in this experiment, they like to ask about how you can make sure your results are reliable. So things that you should not change is, for example, always using the same hand, the same position, use the same ruler. So for example, some rulers could be heavier so they would fall faster. The height where the ruler is dropped from should be the same. And also the person dropping it should be the same because different people could drop it with different force. Again, whenever you're talking about experiments, remember to mention these 3 points. Repeat, calculate a mean, and compare. Okay, not just for this example, but for any other experiment as well. You should always make sure you include that. Okay, now investigating reaction time can be done with a ruler or it can be done with a machine. So this particular one, you wait for like a flash to go off and then you have to quickly press the button. Now that will calculate your reaction time. So why are machines better? For 3 reasons. Number 1, they are precise. So for example, it will give you the results straight away. It will you don't have to kind of read off the ruler and work out the reaction time. So there's no human error. They are accurate because they can give the results in much smaller units, so in milliseconds as opposed to seconds. And finally, they are less predictable. So for example, if your friend is dropping the ruler, if you analyze their body language, you can kind of predict, oh, he's about to drop it now. But with the computer, you can't really predict it. So again, that's makes it more reliable. Moving on to the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is all about hormones. What is a hormone? It's a chemical messenger that is produced by glands. It travels in the blood and it binds to target cells. So those are the 4 main points you have to mention when talking about hormones. Now, again, our endocrine system is comprised of different glands around the body. So you have the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland. So I've made a table with all the different glands in bold and the hormones that they release and what the hormone does. Of course, there are some glands are only found in some genders. So make sure you be aware of that. Moving on, so to compare nerves with hormones, nerves are fast because remember it's electrical impulses. However, remember, there's a little bit of it that is still chemical. Between the synapses chemical, but the majority of it is electrical, so it's faster. Hormones are slower because they travel in the speed of blood. Nerves act for a very short time. Imagine when you get pinched, you feel it for that 1 second or millisecond. After that, you don't feel it. But hormones, they act for a longer time. So again, puberty, for example, is controlled by hormones. Puberty takes place over many days or weeks. It doesn't happen the next day. You don't wake up and, I'm an adult. Moving on, nerves act on a very precise area. Again, if you get pinched, you only feel it in that particular area. You won't feel it through the whole of your body. But again, hormones, they act in a general way. So again, with puberty, it acts over the whole body. You don't just it's not just in a particular area. Okay, moving on to blood glucose. So blood glucose is quite important because again, maintaining it prevents you from having diabetes. With blood glucose, you have 2 scenarios. One scenario is if you have too much glucose in your blood, and the other one is if you have too little glucose. So let's look at the left one. Now, the main 2 organs that are involved are the pancreas, which creates the hormones, and the liver. Okay, so let's say a person has just had a meal. Their blood glucose levels is going to increase. Now, what's going to happen is the receptors will detect that, and pancreas will then release insulin. insulin will be released from the pancreas and it's going to make its way to the liver. And what it will say to the liver is that it will say, take all of this glucose from the blood and store it inside yourself. Now, when glucose gets stored in the blood, it gets turned into something called glycogen. Okay, so glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. Starch is the storage form of glucose in plants, by the way, as a side note. Okay, and once the glucose has been stored in the liver, then blood glucose levels begin to drop back to normal. By the way, glucose gets stored in two places. One is in the liver. The second one is in skeletal muscle. The reason it's in skeletal muscle, so for example, biceps, triceps, leg muscles, is because those muscles need energy for respiration in order to contract and move. Okay, so liver and skeletal muscle. Now, if you don't have enough glucose in your blood, let's say you haven't had a meal for a long time, so then what happens is, again, receptors detect that, and then the pancreas releases glucagon. So that gets released, glucagon goes to the liver, and it says to the liver, all that glycogen that you stored, okay, I need some of it back now. So it breaks it down back into glucose, and that gets released back into the blood. Okay, what is diabetes? First of all, there are two types. The first one is type 1, in which people do not have a functioning pancreas. So the pancreas cannot actually make insulin. So if they have a meal and their blood sugar levels go up, the pancreas will not be able to produce insulin, and therefore they will not be able to lower their blood sugar levels. For those people, we give them insulin injections. Okay, type 2 diabetes is environmental. So you're born with a normal pancreas. However, because you've been having a very unhealthy diet for like maybe 10, 20, 30 years, now your liver is actually become resistant to insulin. So how do we treat these people? First, we tell them to diet. So reduce your sugar levels, and also to exercise. Because exercise, remember, involves respiration, which involves using glucose. If that doesn't work, then we can give them insulin injections.